Howard Schultz and Starbucks. The man who brewed an empire, lost it, and won it back. In 1987, a man from the Brooklyn projects walked into a boardroom and convinced investors to let him buy a tiny six-store coffee chain. The owners didn't even want to sell. They thought he was too ambitious, too eager to change what they'd built. But Howard Schultz didn't take no for an answer. He raised $3.8 million, bought the company out from under its own founders, and turned those six stores into the most dominant coffee brand the planet has ever seen. Over 23,000 locations, a $100 billion empire. And then, almost overnight, he watched the whole thing start to collapse. Not because of a competitor, not because of a recession, but because of what success itself had done to his company. This is the story of how Howard Schultz built Starbucks, lost his soul in the process, and then pulled off one of the most remarkable comebacks in American corporate history. Before we get into the rise, you need to understand something about Howard Schultz. This isn't some guy who inherited money or went to an Ivy League school and fell into entrepreneurship. Schultz grew up in the Bayview housing projects in Canarsie, Brooklyn. His father bounced between low-wage jobs, truck driver, factory worker, cab driver, and never had health insurance, never had a pension, never had any dignity in his work. When Howard was 7 years old, his dad broke his ankle on the job, and the family had no income and no safety net. That image, his father lying on the couch with a cast on his leg and nothing coming in, stayed with Schultz for the rest of his life. He's talked about it in almost every major interview he's ever given. Schultz got out of Brooklyn on a football scholarship to Northern Michigan University. He was the first person in his family to graduate from college. After school, he worked his way into sales at Xerox and then at a Swedish housewares company called Hammerplast. And that's where the story really begins, because in 1981, Schultz noticed something strange. A tiny coffee bean retailer in Seattle was ordering an unusually large number of drip coffee makers, far more than accounts 10 times its size. The company was called Starbucks, and Schultz flew out to see what the fuss was about. What he found blew his mind. This little operation, founded in 1971 by three academics, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker, was selling whole bean coffee with an almost religious devotion to quality. Customers were obsessed. The stores smelled incredible. The people behind the counter actually knew what they were talking about. Schultz fell in love with it immediately and basically begged them for a job. It took him over a year to convince them, but in 1982, he joined Starbucks as Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. Now here's where Howard Schultz's vision diverged completely from the founders. In 1983, Starbucks sent him to Milan, Italy for an international housewares show. While he was there, Schultz walked into an Italian espresso bar and had what he's described as an epiphany. The barista knew every customer by name. People were laughing, talking, lingering. The coffee wasn't just a product, it was the excuse for a community experience. Schultz counted 1,500 espresso bars in Milan alone. He came back to Seattle and told Baldwin and Bowker that Starbucks needed to stop just selling beans and start serving coffee drinks in store. They needed to recreate that Italian coffeehouse experience. They said no, absolutely not. They were coffee roasters, not restaurant operators. They thought serving drinks would dilute the brand. So Schultz did something bold. He left. He started his own coffee bar chain called Il Giornale in 1985. It worked. Customers loved it. And when Baldwin and Bowker decided to sell Starbucks 2 years later to focus on Peet's Coffee, Schultz raised the money, bought the whole company, merged it with Il Giornale, and kept the Starbucks name. He was 34 years old, and he now owned the brand that would change how the entire world drinks coffee. What happened next was one of the most aggressive and successful retail expansions in history. Schultz opened stores at a pace that most analysts thought was reckless. By 1992, Starbucks had 165 stores and went public on the NASDAQ. The stock rose 70% on its first day. By the year 2000, There were over 3,600 locations. By 2007, over 15,000. Starbucks was opening an average of 6 new stores every single day. But Schultz wasn't just building a coffee chain. He was building a brand with a conscience. Or at least that was the idea. Remember his father on that couch with a broken ankle and no insurance? Schultz made Starbucks one of the first major companies in America to offer full health benefits to part-time employees. He introduced stock options for baristas, calling the program Beanstalk. He refused to call workers employees. They were partners. This wasn't just PR. Schultz genuinely believed that if you treated people well, they'd treat customers well, and the business would take care of itself. And for a long time, that formula was magic. But something started to shift around 2006 and 2007. And Howard Schultz, who had stepped down as CEO in 2000 to become chairman, could see it happening in real time. Starbucks had grown so fast and so aggressively that it had started to lose the very thing that made it special. In February 2007, Schultz wrote an internal memo that was never supposed to go public. It leaked, and it was devastating. The subject line read, "The commoditization of the Starbucks experience." In it, Schultz wrote that the company's decisions to automate espresso machines, use flavor-locked packaging, and pursue relentless store growth had led to the watering down of the Starbucks experience. The stores had lost their soul. The romance was gone. The smell of fresh ground coffee had been replaced by the smell of burnt cheese from breakfast sandwiches. He basically admitted that in chasing scale, Starbucks had become exactly the kind of soulless, cookie-cutter chain he'd originally set out to disrupt. And the numbers proved him right. In 2008, Starbucks reported its first ever decline in same-store sales. The stock price, which had peaked near $40, cratered to under $8, nearly a 75% drop. The company was closing stores for the first time in its history. Nearly 600 locations shut down. 7,000 employees lost their jobs. Wall Street was writing obituaries. Analysts said Starbucks had overexpanded, that the premium coffee market was saturated, that McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts were eating their lunch with cheaper alternatives. Meanwhile, the 2008 financial crisis was hammering consumer spending. People weren't exactly lining up to pay $4 for a latte when they weren't sure they could make rent. Schultz had been watching all of this from his chairman's seat, and in January 2008 he did something almost unheard of in corporate America. He fired the CEO he'd handpicked, Jim Donald, and came back to run the company himself. Not as a figurehead, not as an advisor, as the full hands-on chief executive of a company that was in genuine crisis. What followed was a masterclass in corporate turnaround. Schultz's first major move was closing all 7,300 U.S. stores for an entire evening to retrain every single barista on how to make a proper espresso. Wall Street thought he was insane. That's millions of dollars in lost revenue for what? A training session? But Schultz understood something the analysts didn't. Starbucks wasn't a coffee company. It was an experience company. And the experience had broken. He killed the breakfast sandwiches. He ripped out the automatic espresso machines and brought back the manual ones so customers could watch their drinks being crafted. He slowed down new store openings to almost zero and focused obsessively on making existing stores better. He launched the Pike Place Roast as a return to the company's quality roots. He invested heavily in digital and mobile ordering, which turned out to be years ahead of every other fast casual chain. The Starbucks Rewards app became one of the most successful loyalty programs in retail history, processing billions in transactions and essentially turning Starbucks into a fintech company that also sells coffee. By 2010, same-store sales were growing again. By 2012, the stock had fully recovered. By 2015, Starbucks hit a record market capitalization, and Schultz was being talked about not just as a great CEO, but as a potential presidential candidate. So what's the lesson here? I think there are a few, and they're not the ones you'd expect. The first is that growth is not a strategy. Growth is the result of a strategy. The moment Starbucks confused the two, it started dying. 6 stores a day sounds impressive until you realize each new store is a little less special than the last. The second lesson is about founder instinct. There are things that a founder sees and feels about their company that no outside CEO ever will. Schultz could taste the decline before it showed up in a spreadsheet. That memo he wrote in 2007 wasn't data-driven analysis. It was a founder's gut screaming that something was wrong. And the third lesson might be the most important. You can go back. Corporate narratives love to tell you that decline is inevitable, that disruption only moves in one direction. Schultz proved that's not true. You can return to your roots, you can admit you lost your way, and you can rebuild, but only if you're willing to do painful, expensive, counterintuitive things that Wall Street will call crazy. Howard Schultz eventually stepped down as CEO again in 2017 and left the company for good in 2023 after a brief return as interim CEO. Starbucks today faces new challenges: unionization battles, changing consumer habits, fierce competition in China. The company's future is genuinely uncertain in ways it hasn't been in decades. But what Schultz built, lost, and rebuilt remains one of the most remarkable business stories of the last 50 years. A kid from the Brooklyn projects who saw something in a Seattle coffee shop, saw something in a Milan espresso bar, and had the audacity to believe he could bring those two worlds together for the entire planet. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe for more business stories like this one.